Well, hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in this webinar of the Year in Internet Analysis 2024, nearly there, in collaboration with Capacity Media and Kentix. I'm Ben Wadecki. I'm from Capacity Media. I'll be hosting this webinar, but it's up to Doug Madory, the Director of Internet Analysis at Kentik, to take you through this today. We're going to be covering the evolving state of BGP security and RPKI ROV adoption. Also, Doug's collaborations with things like Wired Magazine, New York Times, their coverage of some of the major submarine cable cuts this year. And then obviously we'll talk through the Cloud Latency Map, Kentik's new tool, which Doug will tell you all about later on as well. So it's going to go on for about 45 minutes. Doug will have plenty of time for asking questions at the end, around 15 minutes. We'll get those sent through. And in the unlikely event of any technical difficulties, just let us know. But simply refreshing the page should sort it out for that. So that's it from me. Doug, it's over to you. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Ben. All right, so we have a lot to cover. It's been a busy year, so let me just jump right into it. So we're going to talk about, as Ben mentioned, the RPKI, some submarine cable analysis collaborations I did with major media outlets, the Cloud Latency Map, and a whole bunch more. So let's get started with RPKI ROV. And the way I begin this story this year has been this incident that took place at the beginning of the year, back January 3rd, 2024, when Orange España, this national mobile operator in Spain, suffered a multi-hour outage. Pretty soon after into the outage, the company had identified this improper access that had caused this outage, and pretty soon we understood what took place here to be a hacker had gained access to the RIPE NCC portal of Orange España by finding a hard to believe password of RIPE admin in a public leak of stolen credentials. Oops. So the hacker got into the RIPE NCC account and tried to figure out what they could do to try to cause some havoc. And the thing they decided to do was to start mucking around with the RPKI information in the RIPE NCC portal. I should note that at the time, RIPE NCC did not require two-factor authentication for the access. That was cleared up within a day, and now that's required. For those of you in North America, AARON has always required, or at least in recent years, it's a global requirement for two-factor authentication. Now it's a requirement for RIPE as well. So the hacker decided they would start publishing new ROAs, route origin authorizations, which we'll talk about in a second. But they would publish them in a way that rendered the legitimate routes to be RPKI invalid and therefore get rejected. So you might think this is kind of an unusual anecdote to bring up in a discussion of the success of RPKI ROV adoption, but I look at this, you can look, this is the first time we've seen ROV used as a vector of denial of service, which is very unique. But to understand why this actually caused an outage, we have to talk about the state of BGP security, because this wouldn't have caused an outage if we didn't have a lot of key ASs rejecting invalids, and that's a mark of adoption. So you can take a glass half full view of this. So let's go through the state of ROV adoption as it stands in 2024. I'll talk about each of these graphs here in a second. So just to bring people back to level set on this RPKI ROV deployment. So for the system to work, we need two steps to take place. One, the resource owners, the people who own the IP address space, need to create ROAs, route origin authorizations, that define the correct origins for the address space, and also set max prefix length. The max prefix length field is optional. That's a common misconception or point of confusion, but you do not need that max prefix length. Sometimes that causes more problems than it's worth, but you can just set the origin, so you're just matching on the origin in the routes. And then step two, you need ASs, so networks, autonomous systems, to reject invalid routes. They use the ROAs, the information in the ROAs, to compare against the messages as they're coming in. When they don't match, they're invalid, they get rejected. So both steps have to happen to identify those bad routes and kind of suppress them from propagating and hopefully keep them from causing a disruption. So I've done a lot of analysis, joint analysis with a guy named Job Snyders, who's at Fastly, and in my opinion, like the #1 leading voice on routing security and RPKI. So he and I do a lot of joint work. We did an analysis last year where we made this bold prediction of when we would have the majority of routes in the global routing table have ROAs. So this graph that may be a little hard to read is from NIST. NIST is the U.S. agency that provides technical standards, and they have a team that does analysis of routing security. And they have this website, this NIST RPKI monitor, that tracks a lot of statistics around RPKI, and it's nice to see these temporal trends. In this case, we've in this graph that we're seeing, the green line are routes in the global routing table. This is the V4 routing table that have ROAs and would be evaluated as valid. You can see starting at around 2020 or 2019, there's a kind of a very straight line, heading upwards. And then the yellow are routes without a ROA, and you can see at the same time there those are declining. And then if you look very closely along the x-axis, there's a red line of those routes that are persistently invalid, typically due to misconfigurations, typically due to misconfigurations having to do with the max prefix length setting that I talked about earlier. So back in 2023, last year, Job and I looked at this and you're like, well, you could draw a straight line here and you could extrapolate when these lines may cross. And so I predicted how about May 2024? It looks like when they're going to cross. I even posted this out on social media and Twitter X and LinkedIn. And man, the pessimism was really high, and I would argue unwarranted. I think if I had added a fifth category of kind of never ever, that might have been the answer that would win out. Man, people, it's not that bad. It's really not that bad. We did end up crossing this line in May 2024, and V6 achieved this last year. This was they were way ahead of the game, in part due to the fact that V6 has less legacy address space to deal with, which can be at times problematic with using RPKI ROV. So, so we achieved this milestone, and so then, part of the analysis that I've done over the last couple of years is, I work at Kentik, and Kentik is a company that is known for NetFlow analytics. We have, I think, 450 service providers, enterprises, content providers, gaming companies, all kinds of companies sending us NetFlow. So we have a pretty good slice of the traffic going through the internet. It's not everything. We don't have everything. Nobody has everything, but we have a lot. And I have an ability to query this traffic to answer questions. And one, when I first got here, was to start looking into like, well, how much traffic do those routes represent as far as the routes that have the ROAs or invalid, those kind of things. And I want to convert this into traffic, and let's say bits per second. We can do packets. There's lots of ways to do this. I'll just choose bits per second. It's kind of a common metric. And when I spoke at NANOG in NANOG 84 in Austin, Texas, this is February 2022, I presented these stats where at the time we were only at 1/3 of BGP routes with ROAs, but we had crossed the line of over 50% of traffic measured in bits per second going to routes with ROAs. And this was due to the fact that we have big RPKI deployments from eyeball networks and content providers. And eyeball networks and content providers, these entities push and pull the majority of traffic, and they punch way above their weight as far as when you count BGP routes. And if anybody here, as many of you may already know, there's routes out there that push almost no, or really are just placeholders and don't actually carry any traffic. So counting them one way or the other is kind of a false, I would argue, a false metric, and the traffic is probably a better way to look at this. At least it's interesting. Obviously, we're subject to the biases of our customer base. It should be pointed out. So this year in 2024, we want to go back and look. We hit that milestone of over 50% back in May. So what's that mean in terms of traffic? Well, let's rerun the numbers and see. The latest I did for a presentation was back in October 2024, or October, a couple months ago. And again, we're over half of the BGP routes, and we're approaching 75% of traffic being valid, going to routes with ROAs, and therefore eligible for the protection that ROV provides. This is both V4 and V6. They both are pretty similar as far as these percentages go. Okay, so that was all just looking at ROA creation and how much traffic those ROAs represent. The ROAs alone are useless if there's no networks that are rejecting invalid routes. So we have to have this step 2, if you remember the 2-step slide from the beginning. And in the step 2, looking at, how do we measure what ASs are rejecting invalids? And there's a lot of different techniques. They're all a little, they all have their pluses and minuses. Job and I decided we would look at just look at the end effect, the macro impact of RPKI ROV rejection, and look at the change in propagation. And so in this case, the way we're measuring propagation is how far does a route propagate across the internet. And if it's getting rejected, we would expect to see the propagation be lower. And on this graph here, we're looking at both in the V4 and V6 tables. There's 3 categories: the blue, the orange, and the green. And in the first 2, you've got ROA, RPKI not found, that's without a ROA, RPKI valid, the route matches the ROA. And in each case, those distributions look very similar in the first 2, meaning that in each case, no one's rejecting these routes. And you have this, the x-axis here are we're using route views data, and on the x-axis is how many BGP sources saw a route, and the y-axis is the count of routes that were seen by that many sources. And so you end up with these peaks where things are globally routed. Everybody's got that route, and so you have this peak. And so you see down along the bottom, this RPKI invalid routes, the distribution gets pushed way to the left. It's a smaller number, but there's, you'd be hard pressed to find a route that is globally routed. It just doesn't exist anymore. That is RPKI invalid, and it really depends on where you're announcing it in the world. But anyway, so that's this measure of propagation. So it's a good sign. But the question this year was like, how has this changed since August 2022 when we first published this? So if we took that green distribution along the bottom and looked at this through time, from the time that we first published this, we can see that this is the line of how many, on average, route views sources, the percentage of, or the number of sources who could see these RPKI invalid routes through time. You can see it's bouncing around a little bit. There's some reasons for that, but it's augering down, and we put the number at 24% decline. It's some kind of decline. Visually, I think that's without question. This approach is kind of challenging because that set of persistently invalid routes is not guaranteed to stay constant from one month to the next. We'll talk about that in a second. Also, and then along with that, propagation is heavily influenced by where you're announcing something in the world, who the upstreams are. So if the routes are changing, then the propagation can change. The route views data set also is kind of changing through time as well. So there's a bunch of things going on. So we wanted to see if we could validate this observation of this set of invalid routes. And so to do that, we look at the RPKI invalid beacons. So that's the next slide here. And so there's 3 vertical graphs here. The first one is RIPE NCC announces a handful of beacon routes, they call them, for lots of things. There's some that kind of toggle on and off at different rates. They're for a number of purposes, but they also have routes that they announce that are intentionally valid and invalid, both in V4 and V6. And so we can see that the amount of BGP sources that could see these routes is visible along the top. This last graph is Job operates his own beacons because he can't be outdone by RIPE NCC, and so we can include those. They all kind of exhibit a similar behavior where the lines along the top, the invalids are kind of drifting upwards as the as the route views data set grows slightly, and then the invalids are kind of drifting down as more more ASs are rejecting invalids, and the propagation is getting less. So I think that is enough, in my opinion, that validates that we are on the right track on this declining propagation of invalids, and we're making progress on that side as well. Another milestone that took place this year is, I think the thing that's helping us the most in the reduction of propagation of invalids are these tier 1 ASs, some of the other tier 2s that are rejecting invalids. We could have a big debate over who's included in tier 1, or what defines a tier 1. I guess by my very traditional assessment, I think Zio was one of the last ones to reject invalids, but hey, they did it this year. We celebrate that success. There's a lot of downstream benefit to their customer base, and we picked this up around April. There's a few little bits of the network that still need to get taken care of. That's actually true for almost all the tier 1s. Those networks are so big, they have some old gear in different parts of the world, but in general, we're seeing Zio added to the club. We're down to just again, depending on your definition of tier 1, we're down to just Telecom Italia that needs to be rejecting invalids, and once they do, I think we're going to have really achieved a lot of suppression of these routes, and that's kind of what we wanted. These are the bad routes that can potentially cause disruption. We want to suppress their propagation, and thanks to Zio for getting that done this year. On the flip side, I have a little process where I can programmatically identify routes that are RPKI invalid, and then we have a little thing where we'll automatically create a little email and send these people out, because a lot of these are persistently invalid routes, and so typically it's a mistake of the max prefix length, as I mentioned earlier. It probably was correct when they first created the ROA and it matched the routing at the time, and since then they've changed the routing, and now these routes are invalid and getting filtered. So here's an example of one using our BGP visualization on the left here. So on the upper graph is a stack plot looking upstream of this of Globe Telecom. At the moment that they fix the ROAs to change the max prefix length, these routes go from being invalid to valid, and boom, they kind of jump off the ground, and they go from very little propagation to global rerouted within a few minutes. Different providers kind of come on at different times. It's kind of an interesting, it's not an instantaneous process, but it is pretty quick. And then again, because I have the benefit of having all this net flow, I always kind of look at like, well, what does this look like in net flow? I'm a BGP analyst guy, but I love being able to see like, okay, real traffic, like what was the real impact here? And so then, I marked out, this is a couple dozen prefixes. We can see that there's a clear uptick in the volume of traffic that's reaching the destination now. Having said that, so then it makes you think like, well, were they having a connectivity problem before, and it was lasting for months and they just didn't address it? Or maybe what's happening here is this uptick in traffic is, it could be automated things like antivirus or something. Finally, these devices can finally reach out to the internet and download their automated things, or maybe malware. It's also a possibility that some of this is just scanning. There is an enormous amount of scanning going on these days of people Z-mapping or looking for vulnerabilities for all kinds of, and so there's a non-trivial amount of traffic, and it could be, I guess if I really try to dig into it, I might be able to answer that question myself, but some of this might be just scanning, that this stuff is now suddenly reachable and now is getting hit with people scanning for vulnerabilities. Right, so coming back to kind of close out this Orange España hack, I guess the way I would look at this, obviously outage is not good. We came out of this with getting two-factor authentication required in all RIPE NCC portal accounts. That's great, but I guess the way I looked at this was, well, this is validating the idea that we have a fair amount of ASs rejecting invalid routes, so much so that it would cause an outage if you were to publish an RPKI invalid, an erroneous, but a ROA that is doesn't match the routing. So again, I look at this as a validation of where we're coming with rejection of invalids. it may still be a small number. It's probably still single digits, maybe even low single digits of ASs, by the numbers. But they're important networks, and this will suppress a lot of bad routes. Yeah, and then as a storyteller, I kind of struggle with measuring success. This is true for any security mechanism that actually is working. Like, how do you talk about and get people's attention about things that didn't happen? And I would just argue that I would do a lot of collaboration with these guys at Curator, also really smart BGP folks that put out a lot of stuff. There are routing leaks happening with regularity, and I don't think that even the people in the BGP space have that much awareness of these, because they're getting handled in a way that there isn't really the disruption beyond the networks that are involved. So I would say there's leaks happening, mishaps happening on a regular basis, and just it's not just ROV. There's IRR filtering. There's a lot of other things. PureLock that are helping. The general state of routing security has improved tremendously from when I joined the industry about 15 years ago. But these leaks are happening, and we just don't know, and that's another way to nod towards success. And having said that, I decided that I would start another blog series. I've just got one of these out right now, is to take some of those leaks that are taking place that may not get capture headlines, but are worth still looking at, of like, oh, we shouldn't be aware that these are still happening. I look at it from a BGP standpoint of what were the prefixes involved, what does it look like, the duration, the scope, and then convert this into traffic, like in this graphic here for this leak from Uzbek Telecom. It leaked a whole bunch of stuff through Rostelecom in Russia. What were the countries that were affected? What were the networks that were affected? You can kind of see this period as that leak is going, and we're seeing traffic getting redirected. And again, the amazing analytical capabilities of our NetFlow platform enable me to look into this and pull up NetFlow records that match the AS path of the leak. All right, so that's going to do it for the BGP RPKI stuff. Again, if you have any questions on that stuff, I love talking about it. I'll talk your ear off. Happy to answer it. But let's move on to submarine cable. There's another area of interest of mine, has been for a number of years, and a couple of collaborations I had with media outlets this year. So one was Wired Magazine. Looking into these cable cuts in the Red Sea, and this was a pretty cool story to be a part of. So let me let's talk about the situation here. So just as you may recall, Yemen has been engaged in a civil war. Right now, the Houthis, these rebel group, have been controlling the country for the last number of years. In response to the war in Gaza, they elected that they are going to start shooting at ships that they believe are associated with United States or Britain or Israel. And so on, and they were doing this earlier this year. And then on February 24, 3 submarine cables that transit the Red Sea were cut. And the initial speculation was, all right, the Houthis, cut the cables somehow. There was this purported threat posted in a Telegram channel that kind of was like, it'd be a shame if something happened to these cables, something along those lines. Not clear exactly how they were going to do it, but anyway, so it seemed like maybe they found a way to cut these cables. So then people started digging into this and trying to figure out what actually happened here. And the theory that emerged, I think, from the submarine cable space was this derelict ship, this Rubimar. The ship had been struck by missiles on February 19th. It was abandoned. The crew was rescued. They dropped anchor, and the ship began to drift and drag its anchor. Mind you, if you're not familiar, the Red Sea is actually a fairly shallow body of water. It's only a couple hundred feet deep. That's pretty shallow compared to the oceans, big bodies of water. So the cables are, if a ship drops an anchor, it very well could be hitting and dragging along the bottom of the seafloor. And so that we had the cable cuts again were on February 24. So the question is, could this ghost ship, as Wired called it in its story, have severed the cables? So Wired reached out. I had already been doing this analysis anyway, and they wanted to marry this up with other sources where they had AIS. This is the tracking on large vessels and major bodies of water. along with satellite imagery to try to see if they could determine the path of the Rubimar, and then use my data with the internet measurement stuff to figure out the timing of the submarine cable cuts and see if those would align. And sure enough, so I started digging into this as soon as it happened. I also reached out to some industry sources that are pretty good about filling me in on things I don't know about, and I learned from them that the EIG was already cut, so this was cut number 2, so it was already out of operation, and we probably wouldn't see any impact from it. So then the question is, all right, so I want to see. Let's find out the timing of CCOM and A1, the other 2 submarine cables that were cut. So the trick with CCOM is Tata. So Tata is a major owner of CCOM, going back 10 plus years. That's the preferred way that Tata provides transit service to providers in East Africa. If you're seeing a provider in East Africa, it's got Tata Transit, it's probably going over CCOM. Obviously, they use other stuff as well, but it's a good clue. And so, if you ever see a disruption in East Africa and a lot of people are losing Tata Transit, it's probably something with CCOM. CCOM, to their credit, is a very communicative cable, and they're very good about. Should be pointed out, they're very good about communication to the public. That's very unusual in this space. It's generally pretty opaque. But I found a lot of examples like this one. This Arusha Art here. We've got a network here in this graphic. We're looking at who are the upstreams through time using BGP data. The y-axis is BGP sources. What was the penultimate network before they got to this Arusha Art network? And you can see Tata in the light green goes away at 9:46. This was one of dozens of examples. You can see this going all across the region. That led me to believe that it was about 9:46 UTC was the timing of this cable cut. They Wired later did get the confirmation that timing matched the information they got from CCOM, so that's nice to have that corroboration. And so then there's a second cluster of disruptions around 9:51 UTC, and these seem to occur along the path of A1. Therefore, I concluded that A1 suffered the failure at 9:51, a few minutes after CCOM. And this is a graphic where you've got Eddie Salat out of UAE. It's maybe a little hard to see in this graphic here, but you've got we're identifying what are the upstreams. We've got a couple upstreams that go away at this time, and traffic is shifted. They lose NTT and Aurelion at this point. So that was the timing that I concluded for that cable cut. And then separately, we can use traffic as well. So this is an example from Djibouti Telecom, also a landing point for A1. And you can see the traffic shifting. So Cogent on the left, this is traffic going through via Cogent to Djibouti Telecom, shifting to going via Telecom Italia at this point. And then you can see it also in BGP, where Cogent gets replaced with Telecom Italia as the upstream. Later kind of reverts back, but that all those timings seem to line up. And then there's one exceptionally unlucky route, this Equity Bank at Tanzania. Looked like it got hit by both. Had the CCOM outage at 9:46, and then A1 at 9:51, and then the route was down. So that's a bad day for them, unfortunately. So then the Wired, then you can see this in the story. They use this AIS transponder data to see where the ship was leading up to the attack. So as soon as the ship was hit with the missiles on February 19th, the data stops. So that's they can follow it up to that point, and after that, then they use a satellite imagery from another source to see where was the ship drifting through time, and line that up that it would seem like it would cross the point of where these cables were cut at the time they were cut. I think they made their case, but I think that's still the leading theory. I think you don't. It's hard to prove these until you pull all the information out of the water. But I think that's been accepted as the cause. Red Sea, again, because it's shallow, it's a uniquely problematic area for the subsea cables. And I would say, having done this for a while, I don't think there's been a case where you have vessels, traversing this busy body of water filled with critical submarine cables coming under, missile and drone attacks. That's a really unique situation. There's still ships getting targeted, and we can come back to having something similar again, where a derelict vessel cuts another cable. This is still a reality that we live with day to day. And I wrote in my piece on this to spare a thought about the for the crews of the cable ships sailing into these dangerous waters, because this is not something they typically have to face. They definitely are not under fire repairing these cables, so they had to go do this. But just like the engineers that are repairing lines in Ukraine, it's really important, and there's people who really believe in what they do, and they go in, and they fix these lines and keep the information flowing and keep the internet going. So my hat's off to those brave souls. And lastly, in a piece of that's a detail that I found very rich, the Houthi Yemen Minister of Telecommunications released a statement after the cables were cut, that reminding everyone that they have to obtain permits and basically pay cash to the Houthi government to operate and fix the cables, that the government has essentially indirectly caused the cuts due to the targeting of ships with missiles and drones. And he adds, this is out of concern of the ship's safety. So, all right, so moving on to this West Africa cable cuts. So only a couple of weeks after the Red Sea cable cuts was this other incident that took place in West Africa. It's a banner year for submarine cable incidents. So I connected up with Jim Glantz. I've done a lot of work with him over the years. I consider him a friend and a collaborator. So he and I did a thing back in 2015. We had this multi-part investigation into online gambling and fantasy gambling. At the time, sports gambling was illegal in the United States over the internet, although now it's all been legalized. So we've been collaborating, and he's always wanted to get on like all of us want to get onto a submarine cable repair ship and see it do its work. It's something that's notoriously hard to do, because those crews don't want any random person. They certainly don't want a journalist on board, but he's very good at what he does, and he was able to get himself onto a ship, which is amazing. But let's talk about what happened in this case. So this is March 14th. We had major disruptions along the coast of West Africa, and pretty soon it seemed that the cause was something that took place near this Trous Sans Fond, this bottomless pit that's on the coast of Cote d'Ivoire. There's a little topological map here from an old academic paper on the right. You can see there's this groove that's been cut into the seafloor south of Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, over the last several million years. And this is a big feature and danger to submarine cables. And let's see. So as soon as this took place, again, when these happened, I try to see if I can figure out who are the what's the timing of each cable cut. So we knew at that point, pretty soon there was about 4 cable cuts that took place. I want to see if I can, looking at impact, measure, when these took place. So again, when we looked at our traffic data, we could see that multiple countries exhibited these, successive drops, these little clear features as traffic drops off, and as another cable gets cut. And yeah, I started to identify, which ones were caused by which. So main one's a good one, where main one is both a submarine cable, a telecom, it's an IP transit service. So that means you're going to be able to see, they're going to prefer their own submarine cable for their own service. They do use other submarine cables. It's not just the one, but that was a good giveaway to see when did main one go down. I think they ended up publishing something anyway. So I had already figured out the timing of that cable cut by the time they published it, so that timing I think is confirmed. And then the rest of these were just based on other details like that. I've been doing this for a while, and yeah, let's see. This is Cameroon and Gabon. You can see these drop-offs as different cables get broken. And each of these graphs we're comparing against the previous day, March 13th, which I'm kind of assuming was a normal day on the internet. And you can see the difference between these two lines, the orange and the blue, is how much traffic was lost as far as from the perspective of Kentik customer and Kentik customers and our traffic data. And then I made a whole bunch of these. We ended up not actually publishing anything because we were waiting on the Times to do their publishing, and Jim kept getting pulled off to do other important stories. Let's see, and then this ACE cable cut really took out Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone. In the end, Google's Equiano cable, which was the newest that was run along West Africa, really came to the rescue for the region. It survived the cable cuts, as it did the Congo Canyon cable cuts that took place in August in 2023. It also has a very high level of capacity, and thankfully it was able to survive and keep some connectivity going, as well as these South Atlantic cables. So SACS, this is the Angola cables that goes from Angola to Brazil, and SAIL, which is the Chinese-funded cable that goes from Cameroon to Brazil. We could see a shift onto those cables again, doing we're figuring out who's doing some inference to figure out how these cables are getting used. But like Camtel, we can see a big shift into going through their partner in the Caribbean for carrying traffic, and Angola cables taking on new transit customers using the SACS cable, as they did during the Congo Canyon incident again the previous year. All these cable cuts were fixed by May 10th, and in the end, the graphics team from the New York Times took this one graphic I had made and then converted it into the graphic you can find. It's a very beautiful piece. There's a lot of video of things happening on the seafloor and sea creatures going, swimming by the cables. It's a nice touch, and so I encourage you to go check it out. It's really well done. They talked to a lot of people in the industry. I walked them around and got them to talk to a lot of experts. Some people who aren't commented or aren't quoted in the piece. There's a lot of people who helped out and try to steer the story to be correct and not too alarmist. But I think in the looking back and zooming out on these incidents, there's been a number of submarine cable cuts in Africa recently in the past year, particular year and year and a half. The number of cables serving Africa has doubled, and I think for a lot of people, including myself, you kind of assume there's some sort of increase in resilience that scales linearly with the number of cables. You double the cables, you double the resilience. I think we're kind of rethinking that idea now. In this stretch of about 9 months, we've had 4 separate cable incidents, each involving multiple cables getting cut at the same time. Part of the challenge here is these undersea events, these landslides, can span tens of kilometers on the sea floor, which is a lot of space, and sometimes they can go even farther. So even though these cables may be spaced out, which is what you try to do to try to increase the resilience, if these things are, these undersea landslides are going tens of kilometers or 100 kilometers, that's too far to try to space. We can't assume every cable is going to be hundreds of kilometers apart from the next one. So the tough questions we have are just reflecting on what are the potential contributions from human activity. We have a changing climate and how we use the land, changing how the river, these rivers operate, increasing underwater turbidity. That's kind of the term for the chaos along the seafloor that triggers these undersea landslides. It's possible that this stuff is getting worse as the climate and the environment changes in Africa. And then we have increased maritime traffic. Big ships with anchors sailing around. There's just more of that going on, and there's more risk as each time a ship goes by. And so that's a risk. The Houthi situation in Yemen is kind of very unique, but if you like analysis like this, I have another piece. I didn't have time to stick into this presentation about other cable cuts that took place in East Africa, but I think that will wrap up the submarine cable section. And finally, let's talk about the Cloud Latency Map. So this is kind of a cool thing that we released this year. So I had an internal version of this for the last couple of years, just to help me identify things that are happening on the internet. And so here's what this is. So Kentik has a line of products in the synthetics performance monitoring space, and so we have software agents loaded in every cloud region of a number of clouds. All the major clouds in the world. So a cloud region, just for that if people are not familiar with that terminology, a region is kind of, the presence of AWS in Hong Kong is considered a region, and the region may include multiple availability zones, and each of those may involve multiple data centers. So it's a whole cluster of infrastructure that exists in a city, and so it gets termed as a region, just to be clear. But often a city is a region, so that's maybe it could be a point of confusion. And so we're actually more like 150. I need to update the slide. Different cloud regions worldwide. We're running measurements of various kinds, traceroute, ICMP, from every cloud region to every other cloud region. So you end up with 10,000 plus data series. And so here's how you can kind of make use of this new free tool. So one piece is just the latency comparisons, and this is what I had started with a couple of years ago. Was like, all right, well, how about every place where the big three, let's start with them, AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, if they're all in London and they're all in Mumbai, well, the difference between London and Mumbai is the same. And do we see, how do the latencies compare for these three along that route? And generally in this space, a lot of those there's pretty tight distributions. There's not a lot of they're pretty stable. So there's only a few views occasionally pop up that are super interesting. Sometimes where it gets really crazy is looking at going between clouds. So we do measure both AWS to AWS along the route, and then we'll do AWS to Azure to Google, etc. And so you can find some suboptimal routing and going between the clouds where you have this interesting handoff between two different networking teams, two different companies with different interconnection strategies. So we kind of try to highlight, within either the intra cloud or inter cloud, what are the biggest differences between fastest and slowest, just to kind of tease out, because like I said, a lot of them are pretty optimized. So we want to find where are the differences. So that's what this does. It kind of computes this over the past week, and it's updated every hour. The other side that's a little more maybe exciting is looking at, we have this 10,000 series of measurements, and like, what are the changes that we're seeing? And I knew going into this, having done this kind of work for 15 years, that in the internet, if you can cast a wide enough net, you're going to find some interesting stuff. And so it was true here as well. And so what you end up doing is, you have 10,000 different series crisscrossing the internet. We end up identifying issues with infrastructure. So submarine cable cuts, we can see the impacts in the connectivity between the clouds sometimes. Again, nobody's getting disconnected, but because something's getting rerouted, you can see a change in latency, you can see a change in the path. And so, if you have a question of like, we know something happened in Singapore yesterday, well, you can just pull that up and just isolate just the view of latencies coming in and out of Singapore and figure out what were the potential changes that this incident may have triggered. And here's just a couple of examples. On a given day, I can find a handful of, find a dozen of things like this. So this one, you see, what's interesting to me is these Australian cloud regions in Melbourne, Sydney, and Canberra from multiple clouds, GCP, IBM, and Azure, all experienced this uptick in latency over the same period of time. That suggests to me there's some piece of common infrastructure that had some sort of problem, whether it's a submarine cable being taken out of service. I don't always know the answer there, but you can see it in the after effects in this type of view. And then another one we have on the left, we have OCI, that's Oracle's cloud region in Jeddah, experiencing increased latencies to both Azure and AWS, like a pretty big spike. And then this other one, again, more recently, just a couple weeks ago, we saw AWS and Azure, the regions in Sao Paulo, normally exchange traffic domestically, so the latency between the two is 2 milliseconds or less, and then it jumped up to 120. So we can see that the traffic is getting hairpinned back to the United States for this period of time, almost lasting a day. That's interesting for people who are potentially using these or having to connect to these, because while everybody would like to maybe just have to deal with one cloud, the reality is almost everybody's a multi-cloud deployment anymore due to mergers and acquisitions, the different products using different best-in-class capabilities and clouds. You end up using multiple clouds, having to connect between them. Here's a couple of highlights I didn't have time to get into in depth, but I encourage you to go look into if you have an interest. So we do a lot of analysis of OTT. This is over-the-top services. So gaming, Netflix, Microsoft updates or Apple updates. Fortnite, we've published a bunch of things. What we'll do is take show off a little bit of our capabilities of look at from our customers that use our OTT tracking service, which is built on combining both DNS queries and NetFlow. I figure out how can we decompose a traffic surge, see who provided it, was it how much was delivered via embedded cache versus transit, that kind of thing. Again, if you're really a nerd for this stuff, I think these are pretty neat topics. We did this ridiculous Tyson Paul fight on Netflix, which had some delivery problems that actually you can kind of see in this jagged slope of this graph behind just above Mike Tyson's head in that graphic. But if you want more information on that, feel free to take a look at those. I also do a lot of analysis and geopolitical stuff. So I've been covering Afghanistan for as long as I've been in this space. I published a piece when the United States departed in August 2024, and then decided I would re-up this and look at where all the predictions. There were some dire predictions about where the internet was going to go after the U.S. departed and the Taliban took over. Some of this has come to be, and some of this has not. From a BGP standpoint, I looked at these subtle changes that took place in the country. We lost obviously all the routing from the U.S. Department of Defense. Some of the companies that just existed to serve the U.S. State Department, U.S. Military departed as well. New companies have come on board, and I got some help from an individual who is organizing the new Afghanistan NOG to help inform some of this analysis. But I encourage you to take a look at that as well. And hey, looking forward to 2025. I know what are we going to see in BGP security? I'm predicting at some point we're going to see this plateau, this ROV, the ROA creation. So we've been seeing this straight line the last couple of years, or maybe 5 or so years. It's been almost kind of uncanny in how straight this line is. It's going to start to plateau as we start to reach other networks that are harder to. There's issues around trying to create ROAs. We want to start talking more about ASPA. This is another mechanism that's built on top of the RPKI infrastructure that helps assert transit relationships and would help identify leaks involving path leaks as opposed to origination leaks, which is really the only thing that ROV is going to help with. And then continue a discussion around BGP-SEC, which is really pretty far from getting deployed. It'll be very interesting to see. We have a new administration coming in this next year. What they're going to do with this FCC proposal to require major telecoms in the United States to require ROV deployments. Really don't know where that's going to go. That was a bit of a controversial thing. I wrote something up on that this year. Global infrastructure going to press on. There's going to be more cable cuts, and we're going to keep keep the lights on. The one thing we haven't mentioned much this year in this presentation is about STARLINK. Obviously, that's on the tip of a lot of people's tongues. It's got a role to play. It can't replace the submarine cables, but it's becoming a very important piece of how a lot of people reach the internet. And finally, we went through some of the capabilities of the Cloud Latency Map, and we're adding functionality to this still. We added Alibaba. We added some more geographic regions or finer definitions of geographic regions to play with. Take a look at it. Shoot me an email if you or reach out to me on social media if you find something cool. And that is going to do it. And I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Doug. Well, we can go on for more than an hour on this. I really enjoyed this as well. We've got a couple of questions already for you, and please ask those in the chat as well. First one here says, following the cuts in the Red Sea, Doug, do you have a view on how traffic was rerouted either via alternative routes via the Red Sea versus terrestrial routes through Saudi, GCC, Iraq, Turkey, and more generally around Africa as well?
It's a really good question. I guess I don't have a confident way to do that. There's only so much I have to be honest. There's only so much inference you can do with the internet measurement data, and yeah, I didn't capture that how the stuff was rerouted, but that would be killer to know. But it's from BGP data NetFlow, there's no indicator, and so you have to infer what cables, and some of this it's gotten harder. I've been doing this kind of stuff for 10 or 12 years, and because these services are spread out across multiple cables, there's not so much of a one-to-one association. So I would say that around Africa, we at the let's see, Red Sea cable cuts. Maybe not in that case, but we could see impacts for the cloud regions in South Africa during the cable cuts last year, but that doesn't pertain to the Red Sea. Yeah, so it's a great question. I don't have a great answer for you. You'd have to find somebody who's.
Got another question here for you, Doug.
Yeah.
Someone asks around, don't suppose you have a chart that shows the shift in traffic to other cables when the actual West Africa cables went down earlier this year?
Yeah, I don't have a chart. I did try to capture that. Again, I mentioned it. It'd be, I have a hard time. Let's see, I'm trying to think how to answer this. We saw a huge shift for like Camtel. I actually hadn't been following the plight of Sail, which is the Chinese cable that went from Brazil to Cameroon. I was involved in publishing the first evidence of SACs being active back in, I think, September 2018. At the time, Sail was, there's a race who would build the first cable. Sail was saying they were operational. We couldn't find any evidence of that. There's plenty of evidence of SACs, and I never, revisited when Sail went into operation. But it's very clear that it's up, and it's not serving much more than Cameroon. But it's So I did, generate some stuff for my own knowledge. I think what you would really want to do is you look at the whole picture of like how much of the region's traffic was shifted, and so when I see a big uptick for Camtel through a Caribbean partner, as well as network shifting to Angola cables, I suppose I would have some sense of how much. I think it would be a small portion in the overall, maybe less than 10% in the overall picture, if I had to just guess. And I think cables like Equiano were carrying a lot more of that traffic.
Thanks, Doug. I hope that answers that question. We've got a couple of people asking about your Starlink analysis. I knew somebody would. We got about 8 minutes left. Go ahead.
Okay. Starlink. I've got something in the hopper. I'm going to try to get out before the end of the year to look at Starlink. Obviously, it's growing. One of the issues is it's getting. Obviously, the service is active all over the world. Or it can be, from a technical standpoint, and what they're doing right now is dealing with the issues of legally operating. Any satellite operator, it's not just Starlink, has to get some approval from the local government to provide service, and so sometimes that has requirements for some sort of local ground, a ground station that would enable the government to perform legal intercept of traffic. So these are just the realities of the telecom space. I'm sure probably a lot of people are familiar with, or it's not a surprise. But requiring the traffic to then come back down in the country so the government can surveil it or intercept it, that does kind of defeat some of the resilient capabilities of Starlink, but it does enable it to be operated in those countries. We do see this showing up, and I've got a neat way to look at this, where this is pulling up. But there's a lot of countries still it's not allowed to operate in, at least not officially, although it can technically they can technically turn it on at any point in the surface of the globe. But yeah, I want to get into some more Starlink stuff, but TBD on that.
Sure. Thank you very much. We've got some more questions coming in. 1 moment. I'm just reading through. I've got a question here asking around which global tier 1 networks are still not rejecting RPKI ROV invalid routes.
I would say the big one is Telecom Italia. for the last first couple of years, I haven't really been mentioning their names, but I think it's time that we started mentioning their name. That they are the biggest network that would have the biggest impact if, and they're the last really big network that isn't rejecting invalids. And so it'd be nice to see them start, engaging us. I'm not sure that they've how far they've done on how much work they've done. I'm not sure there is a plan. If there is, I hope somebody could let me know, and we would think that maybe it's going to happen at some point. But there's depending on your definition of tier one, there may be some more. If you have a broader definition, there may be some other networks. But in my mind, that's the big one that would be great to get that the last tier one.
Thanks, Doug. I got another question here. How do you guys at Kentik know how much traffic is going to RPKI invalid routes?
Yeah, so that's interesting. Where we upon ingest, as we're pulling in this traffic, net flow records from the customers, each record gets kind of decorated with a bunch of attributes of like geolocation. A whole bunch of things get added, and that enables us to then make queries against those attributes. And so a neat thing that we added a few years ago, in part to just help people understand if they were to start rejecting invalid routes, how much traffic would they lose? That was the big question people were concerned around before the adoption started really getting going. The answer was typically going to be you're not going to lose anything you care about, and but people still want to test that out. And so we added this functionality. That's where that functionality comes from. But now I have this ability to then say, all right, let me pull up all of our net flow and look at from the perspective of the router that generated the net flow record at that time, which is I think really super useful. What would happen? What would have happened had it rejected the route, or what was the RPKI evaluation at the point from that router, and then it gets pulled back, and then I can make these queries. That's how we're doing it. And I explained maybe a little more in depth back on an analog talk a while back, but it's a great capability for me as an analyst.
Thanks, Doug. Got another question here that asks, if building more cables does not linearly increase resilience, do you think there is more that operators can do at layer 3 to enhance network resilience, perhaps?
Yeah, so I think I was kind of surprised and maybe a little disappointed in I think in the continent of Africa, there's been a lot of development of local hosting, of local, the local scene is a vibrant telecommunications, space. I guess depends on which country we're talking about, but let's take the big networks, big countries like say Nigeria and South Africa. There's a lot of local hosting, a lot of telecoms, a lot of capability there. And like in the case of Nigeria, you had like payment systems that were important that were now inoperable, and so I think I have to go back and look at maybe it's one of those cases where you just you don't know the dependencies until you have the outage and figure out like, oh, it turned out that the authoritative DNS for this service is actually hosted back in the United States and we can't reach it. But we should be at a point where a lot of these things can survive a cable cut. Or I remember I was at a conference earlier this year talking to an operator from South Africa who described for me this scenario that I guess I wasn't aware of, but it kind of makes sense, where you have content providers, will have CDNs will have local caches, and this delivers the majority of traffic in a lot of any part of the world. And so if you lose a cable, you still have this local cache that has the data that you can use to provide the content. However, the way that these CDNs typically work is that if the local cache detects any problems calling back to home base, it will take itself out of operation. And so this local cache that probably could have served maybe stale, but it would serve data that's better than nothing, gets taken out of service, forcing the local network operators to then rely on the international transit that now has been degraded due to the loss of submarine cable. So we're actually compounding. We have some things right now where we compound the problem, and I think we have to kind of take a new look at maybe that worked when maybe that style of CDN operation works in certain parts of the world, but when we lose cables in like an African country, for example, that's not helping, and we'd rather serve stale data than no data.
Thanks, Doug. We've got a couple of questions and probably not enough time for all of them, so I'll ask one. If you don't ask
Okay.
your question, please just reach out to Doug. His email is right there in front of you. He'll happily answer it. Just finally, Doug, very briefly, do the clouds on this really care about latency between one another?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've gotten this, and they probably don't, and they probably don't care so much. I mean, there's a lot of, out of that 10,000 series you've got, like, Tokyo to, Johannesburg. How concerned are they of the latencies between those two very far away places? It's probably not a big deal. What I find as a analyst of this data, that those anomalies are often indicative of connectivity issues affecting a cloud region. And so this mesh test, because of how exhaustive it is, it's good at identifying these anomalies that we might not have surfaced through another way. And ideally, the customer, Kentik customer, would use these tests to measure to their own, network from their cloud deployments and figure out, is their connection to their own cloud working? We can't do that for everybody because we don't know. We're just doing this, demonstrating this, going from region to region. But you'd want to, the way you typically work in a paid service, is that you'd run these tests to and from your own network to your cloud deployment to make sure your connectivity to your cloud is optimal. But yeah, I think this is more just indicative of connectivity issues when there's problems, and I find it pretty useful and sometimes entertaining that way.
Thanks, Doug. Again, if we didn't get your question today, please feel free to head out and contact Doug after this. But for now, that's it. That's all we've got time for. Doug, thank you so much. What an hour. I feel like we should go on for another hour. We don't have the time. Folks, please feel free to reach out to the Kentik team for more information, especially about their new free tool, the Cloud Latency Map. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate the time so close to the end of the holidays. We hope it's been a useful experience. Don't forget to subscribe to Capacity Media as well for all of your more webinars like this, as well as news, views, and insights and more. Doug, thank you for your time. Thank you, everyone, as well.
Thanks
Thank
a
you
lot.
so much.